Right now in our course of our semester, our students, this is the end, kind of basically. They have I think 2 more weeks of classes and then a week of finals, and that's it. And it is really good, I think, in a lot of ways. Also, because you're in the home stretch, and that's one of the things about the home stretch is like, okay, you can see the finish line. This is really good. At the same time, the problem with the home stretch is like in a race. The home stretch is often the hardest part of the race. Like that's where things get really, really difficult. In fact, if you've ever run a marathon, sometimes they say this about marathon running, is that the race doesn't really even start until mile 20. Now, yes, you have to get through mile 0 to mile 20, but the race doesn't really start until mile 20. And the hardest part of the race is from miles 23 to 26.2. It's just, that's the crux of the race. That's where either the race falls apart or that's where you come through in the race. And so it's one of those things where, yes, here we are. I mean, here on campus at least. Here we are in this place that's the home stretch. And again, it's so good, but it's also so difficult. And that could be the case for anyone joining us right now. It could be the case right now in your life. You are, maybe you don't even feel like the home stretch. Maybe it feels like so far from the finish line, but it is that same place where it's, things are difficult. Like maybe you might be in one of those seasons of life where it's just, I don't know how I'm going to make it. I don't know how I'm going to have one more lap. I don't know how I'm going to put another step in front of me, because that's just kind of how life is. And there's a kind of a word of encouragement in that, right? So whether that be for our students or for wherever you're at, that I remember this truth, and it's just so powerful. It stuck with me. It is that good times don't last. No, that doesn't sound very happy. Earlier in this week in Duluth, it was like 70, almost 80 degrees. And then it got into the 20s because good times don't last. That's one of the things. Good times don't last, but also neither do bad times. This is just the reality of life. Good times don't last, but neither do bad times. And so here we are in the middle of the race, though. Here we are at this point of the race where maybe it's good times, maybe it's bad times. I know that neither of them are going to last. So the question comes up in the home stretch, what lasts? Like what does last? If there good times don't last and bad times don't last, then what does last? St. Paul writing to the Corinthians in chapter 12, in chapter 13 as well, talks about all these good things and all these struggles too. He says there's prophecies, there's tongues, there's gifts of wisdom, there's miracles, there's, again, an abundance of gifts. But at the end of the whole thing, in chapter 13, St. Paul says, but in the end, there are only 3 things that last. And then there are 3 things that remain: faith, hope, and love. And he goes on to say the greatest of these is love. And so that's what we're going to do for the next 3 weeks in this home stretch. These are these 3 things that are going to take us to the finish line. These are 3 things that are going to get us through this, whether that's a time of joy in your life right now, a time of preparation in your life right now, a time of transition in your life right now, or maybe it's that home stretch where it's just a time of difficulty and a time of just slogging away and just like trying to put one foot in front of the other. These 3 things that last, only 3 things remain. What lasts? Faith, hope, and love. So today we're talking about faith. Because in the second reading today, St. Peter, what does he say? He says, oh gosh, we're going to all throughout Easter season, we're going to walk with Peter. He's going to be our second reading, like for almost the whole thing, if not the entire whole thing. But St. Peter today, he says this, he says, you'll have to suffer. It says you will, or it says you may, but it says, we'll just take it. It says you will. You will have to suffer through various trials. And we can ask the question, well, like, what do you mean? What kind of trials? And Peter, of course, he means the ordinary trials, the things that come to us in life, just the difficulties of life, sickness of life, griefs and losses and sorrow, just the ordinary trials of life. Peter, it means that. But he also means a certain kind of trial. And it's the certain kind of suffering, a certain kind of trial that is a result of faith. It's a certain kind of trial that comes to us, not just because life is hard, but it comes to us because we have faith in Jesus. And this is so important because the people who St. Peter's writing to, he's writing to the whole church. Because here, right, he's the Bishop of Rome. He's writing to the entire church. And he's basically saying, okay, you've come to believe what we all celebrated last week. You've come to believe that Jesus Christ, he lived for us, he suffered for us, he died for us, and he rose from the dead for us. And you've come to believe that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Lord, just like St. John says at the end of the gospel today. But because that's true, it means now you're living a different life. In fact, at the end of John's gospel, what does he say? He says, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these have been written. Why? These have been written so that you may come to know and believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, when he says you may have life in his name, that doesn't just mean that you're going to have eternal life. Although, yes, bonus, huge. He also means because of this, because you've come to believe, by believing, you will live a life of faith, meaning that faith is going to do something in your life. The faith is actually going to change your life because it is of no use to anyone to say that I believe Jesus is the Lord and then to go back to business as usual. It is of no use for our lives to say I know that Jesus was raised from the dead and then to live my life as usual. That because Jesus has resurrected, because of what we celebrate every Sunday, but especially last Sunday, my life has to change. I have to live a life of faith. And that, what that means is that my faith, what I believe, has to move me. It has to act. I'll say it like this. I have to have a working faith. I have to have a faith that works. Now, it's interesting because if you there's been some studies that have gone out in the last number of years about faith in America. And it's really shocking to note that there aren't a lot of atheists. There's a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious. That's a kind of growing trend. But when it comes to actual atheists, people who say, I do not believe God exists, or the opposite, I believe God does not exist. It's something like only 10% or maybe even less than 10% of Americans would actually say that, would actually say, I do not believe that God exists. The problem is not that. The problem is not that, wow, we have 90% of Americans. 9 out of 10 people would say some kind of spiritual being, some kind of force, some kind of God exists. The problem is not with the number of people that say they do not believe God exists, but what you might call, what John Paul II called practical atheists, what other people have called Christian atheists, which means they say, I believe that Jesus is God, but they don't live like Jesus is God. What a practical atheist is someone who says, yeah, no, I profess faith in God, or even I profess faith in Jesus Christ. He has risen from the dead. He is the Lord. But I don't live like that is true. I say that is true, but I don't live like that is true. And so for all intents and purposes, I'm an atheist. Practically speaking, it is as if Jesus Christ never came to this earth. For all practical purposes, it's as if Jesus Christ never died and never rose from the dead for me, because it has made no difference in my life. This is the kind of faith that is, again, it doesn't work because it doesn't move, it doesn't act. Now we can contrast that, of course, with the first reading today, the Acts of the Apostles. In Acts chapter 2, it says, now the disciples, and everyone who says that I believe Jesus is Lord, I believe he rose from the dead, I believe Jesus is God, it says the disciples then devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles, to the communal life, to the breaking of the bread, and to the prayers. And this is, what does that mean? Well, all four of those terms mean something not just for them back in the day, they also mean something for us. So these four things they devoted themselves to. The disciples devoted, in fact, it's even more important to recognize that another translation doesn't just say they devoted themselves, it says they devoted their lives to these four things. They devoted their lives to the teaching of the apostles, to the communal life. Basically, they're sharing their stuff. If anyone needed anything, they would share. They would take care of the people around them. To the breaking of the bread, which has always been interpreted as code for the Eucharist, and the prayers, like a living life of prayer. And so if I'm going to be a disciple, if I'm going to say that I believe Jesus is Lord, I believe Jesus has risen from the dead, if at any point in the last week after Easter, you said, yeah, Jesus Christ is risen, he's risen indeed. Or if you say, like, I believe in the Lord, I'm a Christian, that means that these four things are going to mark your lives. So the teaching of the apostles and their successors, right? That's belonging to the church and believing in what the church teaches us. Secondly, the communal life. Do I actually take care of the people around me? In the early church, it was for the widows, the orphans, for anyone who needed help. In our lives, it's the same kind of thing. Is there anyone around me who needs help? Do I actually care for them? That's the communal life. Third, the breaking of the bread. Do I participate in the Eucharist? And fourth, the prayers. Do I have an active prayer life? Now, these are four markers. These are four distinguishers. In fact, these are four aspects of what it is to be a disciple of Jesus. And it says those disciples devoted their lives to this. It wasn't just kind of like a club they were a part of. Like, right, being a Catholic wasn't just like, well, I'm part of the Rocket Club, and I'm part of the Rotary Club, and I'm part of the Lions Club, and I'm a Catholic. I go to St. Joe's, or whatever the thing is. It is, they devoted their lives to this truth. They devoted their lives to this reality. They marked these things, defined the Christian life. Because this is the truth. If Jesus is risen from the dead, then my life has to change. If Jesus is God, then my life has to change. If this whole thing is true, it is of no use for me to say, I believe that this is true, and then go back to my life as usual. I have a choice to make. And this choice is not, will I just say I believe it, but will I actually let it change my life? This is the second Sunday of Easter. It's the Sunday of Divine Mercy. And again, this is one of those things that this bridges the gap between here's what Jesus has done for all of us versus here's what Jesus has done for me. This is the clear distinguishing mark, God's mercy. Because when we're offered mercy, we have a choice to make. So one of my favorite stories of all time is a story that everyone knows. I mean, you probably all know this already. It's called Les Miserables. So written by Victor Hugo back in the day. And the protagonist of the story is a man named Jean Valjean. I started reading this book in high school because I thought anyways, it was great. I didn't finish for years. But Jean Valjean is the protagonist, right? So when he's a young man, he gets thrown in jail because he was stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister and her starving children. So super unjust. And he's in jail for 20 years because he keeps trying to escape, he keeps getting caught, brought back, and he's put on this chain gang. He's treated like an animal, and so he sees himself as nothing more than an animal. After 20 years or so, he gets released. But he's not free because he has these papers. And every town he goes into, he has to go to the constable's office, right, to the police, and show them that, yes, I was a felon, I was arrested, I served my time, and now here I'm free. And so he'd be run out of town wherever he went. If he wanted to stay overnight in a place, he'd have to show them his papers. If he wanted to get work, he had to show them his papers. And so the world rejected him. Every person rejected him. So he basically said this: if this is how the world's going to treat me, this is how I'm going to treat the world. If this is how people are going to treat me and how they're going to see me, then this is how I'll be. And there's a turning point in his life where he goes to the house of this bishop he just thinks is a normal priest, and he knocks on the door and asks for some food. And he says that he's a convict and whatnot. And the bishop, rather than just giving him some food and sending him on his way, he invites him into his home. And he has a meal for him. He sits down with him at dinner and even offers him a place to stay. He gives him a bed for the first time in over 20 years in this man's life, Jean Valjean's life. To repay him, Jean Valjean, who sees himself as nothing more than an animal who just needs to stay alive, he gets up in the middle of the night and he sneaks through the house and he goes into the bishop's bedroom with plans to murder him. Something changes his mind. But so instead of murdering him, he just steals from him. He steals all the silver that he can find in the house, runs off into the night. As you probably might know, the story is he gets caught by the police. But he lies and says that, no, the bishop gave this stuff to me. So the police don't believe him. They bring him to the bishop's house and they tell him the story. Bishop, this man says that you gave him all of this silver. And the bishop covers for Jean Valjean. And he says, yes, but he says, I'm confused. You left in such a hurry that you forgot to take the most precious items that I gave you. And he goes to the mantelpiece and takes down these 2 solid silver candlesticks, and he gives them to Jean Valjean, and he dismisses the police. And in the musical, it's powerful. It's so incredible. It's this huge moment where the bishop looks at Jean Valjean and he says, now remember this, my brother. You see in this some higher plan. You must use this precious silver to become an honest man. And he goes on, he says, by the witness of the martyrs, by the passion and the blood, God has raised you out of darkness, and I have bought your soul for God. Jean Valjean, in the musical, he just kind of he sings a song and has conversion. In the book, he wanders away in a daze. This is a man who all he's ever known is justice and injustice. All this man has ever known is being, again, treated like a criminal and being seen as an enemy. He's never known mercy a moment in his life. But here mercy has been offered him. And he has a choice to make. And as Victor Hugo describes this just this critical moment in Jean Valjean's life, he realized that this choice will then set the course for the entire rest of his life. If he chooses to receive the mercy, if he chooses to actually let that mercy into his heart, it will change the rest of his life. Or he could say, yep, it's true. He gave me the extra silver, and now I can just keep on living the same life I've been living. I can receive this mercy and then live as if it was never offered to me. It's kind of like what St. John was saying in the end of the gospel today. You've come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That you actually can live a life of faith. I think that's why St. Peter, in the second reading today, he says this. He says it so clearly. He says, God in his great mercy gave us a new birth to a living hope. In his great mercy, he gave us a new birth to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. This is true, and it's been offered to you and to me. And because of this, you're going to have to suffer through various trials. Why? So that the genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that is perishable, even though tested by fire, may prove itself. And that's what's going to happen in the homestretch, right? In these last few weeks, and in any moment of our life, in fact, in the worst moment of our lives, we're going to be invited to answer this question. We're going to be invited to answer the question of, will I receive God's mercy or will I reject God's mercy? It's one of the reasons why mercy is so powerful. Because it meets us in our failure. In today's gospel, Jesus shows up into a room full of failures. Jesus shows up into a room full of people that he gave his life for, and they all ran away. Jesus shows up into a room of people who he called friends, and some of them denied that they even knew him. I mean, think about the incredible amount of guilt they would experience, the incredible amount of shame they would experience. Think about this. Jesus is stepping into this room of all these people who are absolute failures at the worst moment of their life. And what does he say? He says, peace be with you. Peace. And he extends to them the offer of mercy. He extends to them the offer of forgiveness. And they're given a choice, the same choice Jean Valjean had and the same choice you and I have. Will I allow God to love me in my weakness? Will I allow God to love me at my worst? Will I allow God to give me his mercy? Will I trust him? Basically, will I have faith in his mercy when I have been unfaithful? Will I have faith in his love when I have been unlovable? And this is the last thing. This day, Divine Mercy Sunday, is given to the Universal Church, I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, by John Paul II, but ultimately from Jesus himself. Why? Because God, I believe it's because for too many years, too many Christians have heard the story and have not lived the story. I think for too many years, we've heard the story of God's love for us. We've heard the story of God's mercy for us, God's mercy poured out. And we said, oh yeah, I agree with that. I believe in that. And then we haven't let it actually change our lives. Because God's mercy is the thing that bridges the gap between this is something that God has done for the world and this is something that God has done for me. And so the church has given us, Jesus has given us confession. Here's what God has done for the world. He has come to save sinners. He died so that our sins could be forgiven. When I go to confession, he comes to save me. When I go to confession, he died so my sins can be forgiven. It's really easy to look at last weekend and Easter and keep it distant from us. That's a story about someone else. That's a story for someone else. But Divine Mercy Sunday is a reminder that God's mercy is bigger than my sin. God's mercy is bigger than my failure. God's mercy is actually there for my sin and because of my failure. And I have, like Jean Valjean, like Peter, like John, like all the other apostles, I have a choice. Here we are in the home stretch. Here we are in a place where life is difficult. Here we might even be in the worst moment of our life. Will I embrace a faith that acts? Will I embrace a faith that moves? Will I embrace a working faith and not only acknowledge that this is true, but like the apostles, like the disciples, will I devote my life to the teaching of the apostles, to helping the people around me, to the Eucharist, to the prayers? Will I devote my life to faith in the mercy of God?